Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to give you an example of a segment survey, and we're going to use Psalm 121 as a text that we can apply the principles of survey to. It's a relatively short psalm, and you can follow along with me and read it, and then I'll break down how we can try to find structural relationships and how we can break it into main units. First of all, let's actually read the text. And I invite you to get your Bible out. And if you need to, pause so you can get your Bible and open it up. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard, but you're free to use the NIV, the ESV, the NASB, the TNIV, a good modern translation, and follow along with me. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who makes you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on forevermore. And if you're doing a segment survey, it's important to read the text multiple times. So I invite you to begin to read through the text multiple times so you can keep the content in your mind. Go ahead and pause this if you need to, because I'm about to show you the results of my survey and walk you through how I got how I came up with the results that I found. So the first thing you want to do in a survey is you're looking for the structure, which means you want to find the main units and subunits. So in other words, how many big chunks would we want to break Psalm 121 into? And then when you find the big chunks, how could you break those bigger chunks into smaller subunits? Remember, the rule of thumb is 2 to 4 main units, each with 2 to 4 subunits. Of course, you can have more than 4, but if you do, you want to just make sure you justify that so you don't needlessly proliferate the number of units, because again, our minds can only hold so much material in place, so you want to chunk it down, break it into, again, 2 to 4 units as a rule of thumb. So try to do that right now. Again, invite you to stop and look at where would be the big breaks in Psalm 121. And when you're ready, go ahead and restart this video. Okay, welcome back. Well, let's go ahead and look at how you'd break the units up. Now, when you look at Psalm 121, you might want to observe a couple of things, that there's probably 2 main units here. Now, I know some of you probably found 4 and maybe even more than that because you broke up 3 to 8 into several different pieces. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what I want you to observe, and let's go back and look at the text just for a minute, is notice how the shift between verse 2 and then verses 3 to 8. In verses 1 and 2, it's, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where will my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. Do you hear the first person speaking there? So you have first person speech in verses 1 and 2, and then note the rest of the psalm is more of a proclamation to someone. So he will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. So it goes to like a third person description of the Lord, but it's speaking to someone, over against myself saying, I know that God will not let my feet be moved. It moves to a second person reference there. So that probably is a justification for breaking the psalm up into a couple of pieces here. Now, we also have beyond the issue of orientation, the content, because verses 1 and 2 tell us that Yahweh is a helper, whereas verses 3 to 8 talk about Yahweh as the one who guards, keeps watch over, protects. And you might have noticed how many times the word watches, guards, protect shows up in 3 to 8. So those would be reasons to break the psalm into those 2 pieces. Now, as far as subunits, I think the first unit breaks up into verses 1 and 2 fairly easily. Where does my help come from? Yahweh is the source of help. And then part 2 breaks up into these lines that continue to go together. So the Lord never slumbers. Yahweh is perpetual shade. Yahweh protects from all evil forever. And so you have, if again, go back and look at the text, verses 3 and 4 seem to go together. Verses 5 and 6 seem to go together, and the same as with 7 and 8. And so again, this is a fairly straightforward psalm to be able to apply the IBS method, which is why I'm illustrating. But just notice the process. You want to break it into the biggest pieces that you can, and then break those bigger pieces into smaller subunits. Again, the rule of thumb is 2 to 4 units, main units, each with 2 to 4 subunits. Now that takes us to structure, and you've watched the videos on the structural relationships. I'd invite you to pull out the structure sheet, the sheet that I have uploaded in the classroom that gives you the major structures. Read through them to refresh them in your mind, and then try to read through Psalm 121 and look for those major structures, remembering that a major structure has to connect the units. So you're looking for, how does unit 1 connect with unit 2? What are the structures at work there? And then verses 3 to 8 is over 50% of the psalm, so a structure that works across all of 3 to 8 would also be a major structure, because major structures either connect main units or control 50% of the material. So stop here and just try to spend a few moments to find a couple of structures, and we'll come back and look at my survey. All right, welcome back. Let's look at some structures. Again, the 50% rule. And as a negative example, many of you probably said problem solution because verse 1 asks a question. But notice that verse 2 is the answer, but that's not a major structure because it doesn't meet either of the two criteria. It doesn't connect units because verses 1 and 2 are self-contained, and verses 1 and 2 together are only 25% of the whole psalm, so it's not a major structure. So let's look at a couple of structures that are actually there. Maybe you noticed that essentially verses 1 and 2 are making a broad statement. They're saying that Yahweh is my help. When you start with a general statement, and then you observe that verses 3 to 8 are giving the specific examples, the particulars of that, that's what's called particularization. It's the movement from the general to the particular. So verses 1 and 2 are a general statement that verses 3 to 8 particularize. Now also, and you could have broken this off, you could also say that verses 3 to 8 connect with verses 1 and 2 by means of substantiation. Again, they give reasons why you can say, Yahweh is my help. And so when you identify a structural relationship, notice what I've done. I write out a description of what I'm seeing, and I need you to do that too. So IBS can never just be about putting labels on things. Give the label and then describe using the content of the segment that you're working in to put flesh on what you're seeing. That allows me to see what you're seeing so I can give you better feedback. And then what you do is for each major structure, you ask a set of interpretive questions. You remember there's 3 kinds of questions, and I'm just going to write them in here. So remember the first kind of questions are definitional. So I have a couple of definitional questions. What is the meaning of each element of the general statement in verses 1 and 2? What does it mean that Yahweh is the psalmist's helper? How do verses 3 to 8 provide the particulars? How do verses 3 to 8 substantiate verses 1 and 2? Those are definitional questions. If I were to answer those questions, I would be defining and describing the content and what this structure is doing. If you have trouble writing questions, start with the generic questions on my structure sheet. They're right under the descriptions of the structures. Now we also have rational questions. I guess I'll put that in bold there so you can see it, and I'll bold definitional as well. Rational questions ask why. So why does the author use particularization to structure this psalm? And I should also say, why does the author use verses 3 to 8 to substantiate the claim that Yahweh is my help? And the last thing is you want to ask an implicational question, and I usually just write implications. So you can think of these as the what, the why, and the so what. What are the deep implications? Okay, let's go on to another structure. You also may have observed some recurrences. There's plenty of noun and verb forms of shamar. This is the word that means keep, or watch, or guard that recurs throughout this. Again, you're not expected at this level to be able to use original language in detail. However, if you have experience and can use Greek and Hebrew in your work, I encourage you, and I will be modeling that, but of course we'll always be using English translations so that everybody can stay together. Also, the word Yahweh, which is translated in English, Lord, shows up repeatedly in 121. Now, you have to be careful here. Typically, I discourage people noting the divine names, but we have to be struck by the heavy use of Yahweh in this psalm. It's used throughout the entire psalm over and over again to make it clear who we're talking about here. Then there's also a theme of permanence that's going on, or the ongoing scope. So it's you neither slumber nor sleep. God's a constant shade. Neither sun nor moon's going to harm the psalmist. In verse 8, Yahweh watches over one's coming in, not going, now and forevermore. So you have this idea of ongoing permanence. So the questions, what are the precise and specific meaning of each of these recurring elements? How do these three elements relate to one another? How does the use of recurrence affect one's interpretation? Why does the author employ recurrence implications? So notice again, we have definitional questions, rational questions, implicational questions. Okay, one more structure, climax with generalization. Again, these could be broken out. So let me describe the climax. The psalm clearly reaches its high point or its zenith in verses 7 to 8. Here, God is not merely one who never sleeps or provides shade, but now Yahweh is described as one who keeps the psalmist from all evil. Remember, what's all mean in Greek and Hebrew? It means all, and will keep the totality of the psalmist being secure. The scope for this is all eternity, and the climax is even heightened further by the threefold recurrence of shamar, keep or watch, right there in these last couple of verses. Now, this is also a generalization because it opens things up by talking about all. This is making a full claim with these other particulars in verses 3, 4, 5, and 6, leading up to this general statement about God protects you from all evil, from your going out to your coming in forevermore. And then you ask, again, the three types of questions for here. Now, the next piece that we need in IBS, I'm spelling words here so you're seeing me correct my work right in front of you, is you do your structures with questions for each, and make sure you ask a set of questions for each structure, and then we go and look for strategic areas. I'll explain the method behind the madness of the strategic areas very soon in the coming weeks. But for now, you think of a strategic area, it's just this assumption, with the assumption that I can't exhaustively study every single verse in this segment. I look at my structures with the assumption that structure leads to meaning, because the structures are the rhetorical devices that the author has embedded into the text that organizes all of the details. So what I want to look for in a segment are what are the smaller pieces, the strategic area, the key verses that if I only studied a small part of the whole would give me the maximum bang for my buck in terms of understanding a structure. So for each structure, you need to have at least one strategic area. And what I note there, if you go back and read through the notes, verses 7 to 8 are actually part of all of these structures. They're part of this particularization with substantiation, or they're part of the particulars and the substantiation piece. The recurrences each of these three recurrences, something happens in 7 and 8. And also the climax with generalization is all about verses 7 to 8, which tells me that a key strategic area would be verses 7 to 8. And here's the whole thing. You just don't pick the verses that you like. You pick the verses that look as though they have the best opportunity to teach you the most that there is to know about the psalm. And all the structures overlap at verse 7 to 8. So that's a natural strategic area. Now, a second strategic area, because we did leave out the general statement in the particularization, is I would say verses 1 and 2 illustrate particularization. And so if you think about it, if you're just going to pick out a couple sections to work on in the psalm, it would make sense to pick out the opening general statement, verses 1 and 2, and also the climactic section, verses 7 to 8. So there's your strategic areas. So you want to make sure that each structure that you found is represented in one of these strategic areas. So it could be that you have 5 structures and you have 5 strategic areas, but notice in my case I listed several structures, but these 2 strategic areas encompass all of those structures. Now the rest of survey is relatively straightforward. I suggest that you make an atmospheric observation, and all you're doing is looking for some adjectives that describe the mood, the feeling, the idea in the psalm. And you might say in Psalm 121 that the imagery evokes feelings of confidence and security, one's senses. Now, genre, this is a psalm, so it's poetry. And if you take a Psalms class, we can break these things down a little bit more. I called it a song of ascent. It can also be a song of trust. But the main idea is this is poetry here. If you're taking Matthew's Gospel or Pentateuch or historical books, you won't just have poetry. You'll also have things like prose narrative. You'll have ideological passages. You can have legal passages. So you want to say something about the genre simply to remind yourself what is the type of literature that you're reading. And then save some room for some miscellaneous comments. And these are other observations that you make that don't fit in anywhere else in your survey. So I just made 3, for example. I note that Psalm 121 talks about sleep. Again, I've been reading the Psalms a lot, and I've noticed that the Psalms refer often to sleep. And for example, you can look at Psalm 3, but it's many other Psalms as well. And I'm wondering, why does sleep serve as an apt metaphor for security? Why does it keep showing up in the Psalms? Again, that's a question for another day, but I just note it there because your survey work, you're going to keep these because you keep your surveys forever, and then you'll always have a starting place for work. So these are good places to put extra notes. Psalm 121 also notes the second of the Psalms of Ascent. The Psalms of Ascent are 120 to 134. How does Psalm 121 fit within that series? Again, it's a bigger question than we're trying to do a survey. Then I also noted, just from my Hebrew knowledge, that the word for help here is ezer. And it's also the word that's used to describe the first woman in Genesis 2, where it says that God makes a helper or a helpmate. So it's just interesting there that we have here's Yahweh's the help. And so it's important to see that word and remember that the word help is not some kind of subservient position. Anyway, that's how to do a survey of a segment. I invite you to, again, go back and watch the process again. Go back and maybe redo it yourself to see what you can come up with. If you have any questions, send them my way. And good luck now on the main assignment in working out a survey on your own. I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.